Good afternoon to you all. Today, Bhutan Tech community will be coming with a live session. As last week we have started with the basic coding in JavaScript, where we have learned the basic of the language, giving a plenty of examples on data types, variables and operators and so on. And today we will be covering on the objects and functions. In a lot of JavaScript courses, they treat these two concepts as two different subjects to teach, and we think that's a big mistake, because while in other programming languages objects and functions are two distinct things to talk about, but in JavaScript they are very related to each other and they are really in many ways same subject. So let's talk about the object and the functions. The first subject or the first topic we will discuss is the object and the dot. Remember, we have already said that objects are the collection of name value pairs, and those values can be another collection of name value pairs. For our purpose now, let's look at the object from a different perspective. Let's think about how an object lives or resides in your computer memories. An object, like we said, is a collection of values that are given names. But what values are we talking about? Well, an object can have properties and methods. So an object can have a primitive data sitting on it, so we call it as a primitive property, and an object can have another object connected to it as a child, so we call it as an object property. And we have an object can also contain a function, but in these cases function is called a method when it's sitting on an object. And when an object have a properties and a method, and this sits in the memory, so this kind of a core object will have a same sort of address in your computer memories, and it will have a reference to these different properties and methods which are also sitting in your computer's memory. Now, they may be related to the address of that base object concept, or they may not, but either way the object has a reference to the address or the space where these different properties and method live. So you think about an object as sitting in a memory, then having a reference to the other things sitting in a memory that they are connected to it. So it knows where it different properties and methods are, like primitive objects and function. So to be more clear, so we can go with the practical session. Okay, I have an empty app.js file, and now I'm going to create our first object. Person, new object slash, and with using, as I've created an object with name person, and I'm going to use a bracket operators, like person using a bracket operators, and inside those bracket I put the name of the values that I'm trying to locate in the memory. So it goes like first name, then I can create a person dot last name also using the bracket operator. So let's So when I use, so it's going to create that space in the memory and give it to the name, and this is the object, and this object will get a reference to the address of that location in the memory, so it will know where the first name is in the memory, and there's going to be a primitive, a string, so it's called a property, and the first name property. So this is the one way to set the access properties. Like we can, without using a bracket, we can also use using a dot notations, like with using object person dot first name. I can console log using a dot notation, console person dot first name. Dot loss. So yeah, after the first name, it is the last name. So let's try to run this code and see. With using a dot notation, I can also get the values of the object person. That is much faster to type, like than the bracket ones. Actually, this is one way to set and access properties, but in other type of a property, you can have other than the primitive, like another object. So I can attach another objects. Let's say with a person, we know that the person is object, and again we can assign a new object inside a person, like a person dot address. I will try to create a new object. Object. So now I'm going to make that instead of the string, number or boolean, I'm just making it another new object, like so. After making that, so it's just an object sitting inside an object. Then I can use the dot operator, for example, and add properties. I can also add properties like person dot address. I can add properties like street. I can give a value for the street also, like it's so many. I can give so many properties like streets, cities, like this. So I can add properties like to my object, my sub object, and my child object, like that. So it's basically the dot operator. It seems much cleaner, easier than the bracket ones. Just remember that the way of creating an object is not only this way, and using of the dot notation, bracket notations. But what I would recommend is that, and the method that I prefer is that using of a dot operation. It's very clean, it's very clear, and also easier to debug and find the problems. So I always recommend that you use the dot operation unless you need to access the property using some kind of a dynamic strings or some kind of strings that can be changed like programmatically, like that. But to start with, always use a dot operators, the objects and the dots. Functions are objects. We are now going to talk about the most fundamental important concept is moving from someone that just uses a JavaScript to someone that deeply understands it and it isn't scared by some of the weird and other looking things that happens inside of it. A concept that will expand your knowledge and ability as a programmer to use a JavaScript in a ways that other modern and a popular programming language can't match. The idea is called the first-class function. In JavaScript, functions are objects, but first-class function sounds very complicated. First-class functions, everything you can do with other types, you can do with functions. Assign them to the variables, pass them around, create them on the fly. And now let's see about what is really mean by functions. Function is a special type of object, though, because it has lots of features of a normal object and has some other special properties. So one thing that people are surprised about when they see JavaScript is that you can attach properties and method to a function. Why? Because it's just an object. So I could attach a primitive, a name value here. I could attach an object. I could even attach other functions that actually does happen and could be useful in JavaScript. In many scripts though, the function object has some hidden special properties. The two important ones are its name. Now function in a JavaScript does it to have a name. A function then can be what's called anonymous. And anonymous meaning it does not have a name, but it can also have a name. It's another property called a code property, where actual lines of code that you have that you write, it will just sit it. So essentially, from the vantage point of anybody's that we are talking about, the code that you write gets placed into the special property of the function object. So it isn't like the code that you write is the function. So the function is the object with the other properties, and the code you write is just one of these properties that you are adding onto it. What is special about the property is that it is invocable, meaning that you can say run this code, run the code sitting on the property. And that's what the entire execution context creation and execution on all of that happens. It's an imperative that have all these mental of the functions in your mind. As we go through this rest of this course, you have to think of the function object whose code just happens to be one of the properties of that object. So there are other things that the function can have attached to it, and it can be moved around, copied, given to other elements or other areas of your code, just like any object or a value, just like a string, just like a number. This allows for some fascinating programming approach, and it allows for some really interesting syntax that can look really weird if you don't understand this fundamental concept. So I will be showing a one demo in code editor. Alright, just to prove it, let's try something. I have an empty app.js file and I'm going to just type out a function. Let's say a function greet, and it's just going to console log hi. So let me try to create a function. So it's a function, but remember we said that functions are actually objects in a JavaScript. So using a dot annotation, I can create a property or create a property, create dot language English. I just added a property to the function in a programming language. That this just isn't possible in any other languages, but in JavaScript, functions are objects, and the code I wrote is just a property of that object. Now, if I can console, if I log this console, log into the console, let's try to see what will happen. Let's see what will happen if I'm going to run this code. Something interesting is happening. In JavaScript, I actually get the text of the function that I wrote. So that's too useful. Not too useful. It's not too useful in this case. But if I actually try to get that property on that function using a dot operation, that let's try to see to get that property using a dot operations. Let's try to run this code now, see whether we can access this greet property or not. Yes, there it is. So basically the value is there in the memory. It's a property attached to the function, just like you could attach a property to any object, because in JavaScript functions are what? Objects. So when I created this function, what did it look like? It looked like the same functions. So when I created this function, what did it look like? I had this greet function, and this function object was put in a memory, and in this case onto the global object, and it had a name. And to the name property, it's a greet, because that's what make my function, and it has a code property that contains the code that I wrote of my function. So if I was to call the greet using the parenthesis, it invokes the code, it invokes that code and causes it to run, causes that execution context to be created. And you have to think of the function as more than just a container of a code. It's just an object. As such, you can pass around. If it sits in a memory at a specific location, it has a property, it has a method. Why? Because, say it with me, in JavaScript, functions are objects. With this, happy weekends, and see you guys on next session with more interesting topics on JavaScript. Thank you.